When it comes to podcast interviews, there are 5 elements that most podcasters tend to get wrong. And that tends to be the difference between creating a great interview or something that somebody listens to and goes, meh, okay. So here at the podcast space, each episode is designed to help you grow your business through the show, but also that you become a better host and craft important, intimate connections with your listeners so that they in turn become fans of the show that promote the show for you for free. Who doesn't want that, right? So how do we create interviews that don't fall into these 5 mistakes? You got to stay and listen. And by the way, hi, I'm Anna Xavier. I'm the founder of the podcast space. And let's get right into the episode. If you're listening to this and thinking, Anna, didn't you cover best practices for podcast interviews or how to create memorable podcast interviews? Aha, yes, we did. Not long ago on episode 63, where I invited Sarah Heater to share her best practices on creating interviews that are incredible. Now, I really wanted to go into some of these mistakes because as someone who produced hundreds of hours of studio interviews, I just saw a lot of interviews go wrong. And I don't want you to be in that situation because, in fact, if you may notice, I actually do a lot of one-to-one with you because one of the main goals of my show is to help you improve. And I feel like sometimes with guests, you're kind of too distracted by the conversation. And so this one-on-one time of me with you helps you cement those ideas in a better way. And so I just saw so many hosts who some of them were media trained, others were still in the beginning journeys of becoming a better podcast host. And I noticed these elements that could be totally preventable. And so before we get into the 5 ones, I just want to preface that I will be giving a few tips at the end, so stick around for those. But let's dive into the one that I think that is something that most people haven't been talking about. But I mean by people, I mean experts in the field of interviewing. And I honestly don't feel like I am the best at interviewing people just because that's part of one of my tips. I don't do it as often and really is about if you don't use it, you lose it. Like the art of having a conversation that is useful for the listener is not one that you just stumble upon. So the first mistake that I see is people focusing on the person and doing a profile of the person instead of the topic. And what I mean by this is that, of course, this is going to be the exception. If your show is solely about interviewing and highlighting people's journeys, then don't listen to this part. But this is something to be aware of. Most podcasts are surrounding, a topic and teaching someone a topic. And oftentimes when they bring in a guest, what ends up happening is that the person has full reign. And again, sometimes your guests aren't media trained or they don't do podcasts as much as you do. So basically, your listeners may be like, well, why did they talk about this person? Why do I care? And so many people, and this shows up in, for instance, the show notes. So the show notes start with the person and not the topic. So let's say I had myself on the show and I would go, Anna Xavier, podcast marketing expert. She has X amount of years of experience, blah, 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 and so on, right? So instead of saying, are you marketing your podcast in a way that attracts listeners, right? What is it that people are doing wrong about podcast marketing that I'm going to be answering on the show? But if you're using your podcast as a tool to network with the decision maker in front of you, and the listeners are the secondary benefit, should we say, then you're going to be just focused on creating and crafting an amazing experience for the guest, because your deal is, I want this person to get to know me, to have a great time, for us to get more intimate in these experiences that we're having, and then they will be interested in working with me if, of course, you've done your homework and it makes sense, right? So something to think about if you're thinking, well, people say that you will grow your podcast faster if you have guests, and it didn't. It's because there may be a misalignment. So instead, let's focus on the topic. And a great example of this is that, for instance, any interviewee that I had on the show, you can go back and listen to the catalog, and you will be seeing that in practice, how I position the person. And I position that as hey, you, the listener, you need to know about this. Now moving into the second one, which is tightly together with the first one. And the second one is reading the bio verbatim. And that's Latin for word by word. And when you're reading the bio verbatim, the problem is that you're not tailoring that bio to your listeners and the listening experience. By the way, it's super boring, especially if you're just listening to someone read a whole document. It just looks super sloppy that you did not even put the work in. And it's absolutely something that your listeners will pick up on. And if you're someone who's trying to become a better interviewer, a better podcast host, do these three things. So one, pick like three things that you find relevant about your guest, right? Like that you know your audience will find relevant. And also weave in why this guest matters. But don't start by, so this guest today is coming to the podcast, and you go on a little adventure and you explain why like this person and you met in this really random situation. Save that for later or don't include it at all, because it basically just excludes the listener right away from that experience. And then last one, sometimes it's fun to incorporate something exciting and random and very almost like, unusual or very underground about the guest, because I had people that did this to me as a guest and I thought it was great because it really shows that you did all of your homework, and as a guest you get excited to be on a show where the person took the time to actually research beyond just the bio. The bio, first off, should be written in a way that if someone is reading it, it's, exciting to read. Plus, the issue with reading bios verbatim is that normally you will trip over some words because you do not use those words. Because normally those bios, the majority of people makes them for them to be included in sections. So sometimes what I do is include a short bio about me. So stuff that is like generic, but as the host, it is your job to find stuff that your listeners are listening in. I'm like, man, like, they crafted that bio right away. And sometimes, and this is where I will fight anyone, like you want to get to the interview as fast as possible. Nobody wants to sit through an intro that is 4 minutes long, like get to the point. So just make sure that when you're looking through all of the things that you're doing on your show, you're thinking about the listening experience. Like you wouldn't want for someone to do, let's say you're in a conference and the time that it's taking for the moderator to introduce everyone, you're like, just get into it. It's the same thing for a podcast, right? So think about how you've been doing your intros for your guests and then how you're doing it now. And so I think it's super important to just make sure that, again, listener experience is paramount for long-term success. And then number 3, inviting someone on the show to fill a spot without consideration of alignment on the topic. I see this all the time. You may meet someone on a conference that you're super excited, maybe they're really cool, and you're like, I would love to have you on my show. Ask yourself, does it make sense for someone to listen to this interview on your show, right? If someone is a new listener and they hopped on that podcast and they listen to that interview and it has nothing to do with what you do, then in the long term, it may impact your consumption because people are going like, do I want to stick around? Is this the podcast representative of the rest? If it isn't, it could create a false expectation for listeners. That's when I actually when I want to talk about a topic and I have a guest, like that's how I justify bringing in a guest, because my show isn't about interviews. So disrupting the pattern of you expecting me to talk to you and suddenly I have a guest, that's how I preface, right? Like justifying having a guest. Now, when we're looking at alignment, again, is it because the person is exciting? Like you can have them for a conversation, you can maybe do an article about it, but including them on a podcast, just because maybe you have a business interest and you want to have them on the show, like I would really advise you to think about it, because at the end of the day, would that one person that you want to have on the show be worthwhile potentially disrupting the relationship and the trust that you have with your listeners just because, this is seen normally with when you're trying to get some clout. So when you want to have a celebrity on the show, someone that may be really relevant in your field, and you're looking around and you're like, well, there isn't really an alignment. This isn't really what I do, but I just want to have you on the show just because I want the internet to know that I had you on my show. Have you had those thoughts perhaps? Guessing you probably did. And I'm not, I'm the same. Like I had people on the show that I was like, okay, how do I position this person? And then I chose not to release the interview because we ended up talking about things that I was like, you know what, like this isn't in alignment because I care for you. I care for the experience that you're having and staying true to the premise of this show. Number 4, having guests and talking over them, and not only talking over them and feel like you have to one up. I think that's how it goes. So basically, if your guest says something, you have to add on to it all the time. And that's so bad. And one of the things that Sarah talked about on episode 63 about creating memorable podcast interviews was, I think, talking about like how can you add value to your listeners without letting like the guest take over as well. So like there's like that balance, right? Like not letting the guest completely run through the show, but at the same time making sure that there's value there you're adding or contextualizing what they're saying to your listeners. But I've listened to so many podcasts where, like, why is the host feeling like at the end of the guest, are they trying to impress the guest? Like, what is it that the host is constantly pushing and pushing? Like, oh, well, but what about this? Or like, oh, yes. And then they go and talk for longer than the guest, right? So ask yourself, can you do instead a follow-up episode and basically, even if you said a ton of stuff, can you cut as much as you said to make sure that your guest does have the spotlight and whatever you're adding? Because again, it sometimes happens where in the heat of the moment, we want to impress the guest and we realize after in editing that, oh my gosh, like we talked so much. This is totally unnecessary. And I sometimes, if my guests are, more relevant or more important, I feel myself like I'm a little like nervous and I may talk too much. But again, that's why post-production exists. That's why if you have an editor, you should chop as much as possible. And my friend Simona Costantini, I was just having a conversation with her right before I recorded this episode, and we were talking about that. I was telling her like, hey, I have 3 of these things that I want to talk about. What are your like icks? What do you think like could really help people improve their interviews? And so she was talking exactly about that, how she sends like the first draft and she asks her clients to then send like revisions and say, hey, like actually like listening back, these things like were totally unnecessary. So again, thinking about the listener experience. How can we create better experiences even if, and this is sometimes like what will happen. That's when if you're editing your own podcast, you have to put yourself and say, is this ego or is this content driven, right? Like, is that necessary that is added, or do I just want to impress my listeners and showcase like, oh my God, I'm so good. So if you feel like you added a ton of stuff that you're like, you know what, like I spoke so much, but it took away from the guest shining or whatever it is, create a podcast episode, a follow-up episode where you're actually diving in some things and like be honest and tell your listeners, hey, I edited so much of this conversation, but I wanted to make sure that after some reflection and all of that, like at the end, I think that this was really relevant. And for my people who are very organized and have a content calendar, well, add an extra episode, a bonus episode, right? Like that does not need to disrupt your whole flow of content. Just add a follow-up episode. That's great. Or schedule it into later in the year, as I often do, where I talk about different things and go, hey, I thought about this that I didn't mention on that episode, and it's episode number whatever, go and listen. So you're creating an opportunity to have listeners consume different parts of your content. And again, not everyone listens to every single episode that you're mentioning. Now, talking over the guest as well, that's part of like having a guest over and like all the mess ups that happen. Like I'm going to share a pro tip here. So one of the things that we had when I was a producer in a studio, not so much now that I do content strategy. Sometimes I do because I'm coaching clients. So in that side, I do talk about these strategies, but if you're someone who in real life does a lot of like active listening so that the other person understands that you're following what they're saying, either one, mute your microphone. And if you're looking at mine right now in the video, I have an Audio-Technica ATR 2100X. I think that's the name. If it isn't, sorry. But this microphone has like a little bit of a toggle on top. And for me to turn it on and off, it would actually make a noise and I would disrupt the cable in the connection. So what you can do is, for instance, the Yeti mic and some of the other mics, the Shure and stuff, they have a mute button. So those are better for that. But if you don't want to, practice in your daily life. I talk about this to clients all the time. The best practice is something that you do every single time. So if you are with clients, if you're doing a lot of conversations with people, start nodding and be self-aware. Don't talk. Don't say, oh my God, that's so right. Because by the way, this is a nightmare to edit, right? And your guest does not need to hear you say that. And it's disruptive in their thought process. So what you can do is just go ahead and start nodding in conversations, right? Like we can do so much with our bodies without speaking, right? Like leaning in, nodding, opening our eyes with excitement. Like all of these things are things that we can do to showcase our interest without talking over them. And last but not least, the outros. The absolute hot mess that some outros have happened in real time in live streaming in my life has traumatized me. So basically, everyone thinks about how to start a show. And very few people plan the end of a show. And what I mean by this is not only about planning the show for you, is planning the show for the guest. When you're having people who are not used to being on podcasts, there are a few things that they will never remember to think about. Even if you do your homework and you ask them, hey, send me the links where you want people to connect with you or something like that. Do not leave it to the guest to remember, because and I'm not joking, I know this feels really weird to talk about this, but this was 2018. And 2018, not that many people, especially like CEOs and people like that, like they didn't really necessarily go on podcasts that frequently. And the amount of times that we were doing a podcast live stream, and the host would ask their guest, hey, if people want to reach out to you, how can they do? And these are real cases. One time a CEO said, well, actually, I don't know our website. My marketing assistant does that. And so basically we were like looking at one another, me across the glass in the production booth, and I'm like, okay. So then the host had to kind of like scramble to close the show, and that threw them off too. Another time, the guests started talking about phone numbers, and so they were like, if you want to follow up, send me a text to 274-987. And we were like, oh my God, like nobody's gonna pull their phones and call, right? Like this is the 21st century. So that was another one. And the last one was the person went on a rant about how like their website was down because they were doing some maintenance, but then they weren't really sure when the website was going to be available. And then, but maybe it was, they didn't know. And I'm like, nobody wants to close a show that is like, oh my God, what just happened, right? So as the host, what you can do is ahead of time, just say, hey, send me the URLs or how to reach out to you for our listeners to have that information. Especially when people start spelling stuff, forget about it. Like I will never remember, like, especially I'm Portuguese. So whenever someone starts spelling or telling me numbers, my brain shuts off in English, of course. So that is something that you should consider as the host. How can you control the environment in a way that you feel like, again, you're in control and nothing goes wrong? All right. So having a form is a great idea. And second is to actually have that close by, right? Like to actually have the form in front of you just in case. Last but not least, have a quick comment, which is always the saving grace of the day. Hey, we'll make sure that we have the link to that in the show notes. And that is your saving grace for the outro. That is, and I had that where somebody was asking me about the URL for a program that I had launched. And I was like, I honestly could not remember. So I said like, the show notes will have that. And so after the episode, I sent that to the host, and that's how we did it. As I was talking to my friend Simona, she also suggested they have a strong anchoring closing statement. So basically, for instance, like the way that I close the show is create imperfect content that moves you forward. And so I know that I can always finish with that. I always tell you like, hey, talk to me on Instagram, or go to the podcastbase.com/podcast for all the resources and blah, blah, blah. Like those are things that I use all the time because I know I don't have to think about them. I can just spit them right away. They're going to go. Another alternative is to actually have them redone in post-production. Nobody cares. I remember many years ago, like the idea that like, oh my God, we have to get this ready. If you have different clothes or whatever, people are going to be thrown off by that. And now nobody cares, right? The more intimate, the more authentic you are, the better. So you could say, hey, did you know that during the recording, I actually messed it up? So here I am in post-production with a different hair and different outfit telling you about this, right? It paints a fun picture. It shows that you're human and you mess up, and it gives your listeners a reason to reach out to you because they see you as a not perfect person. So to avoid all of these mess ups, all these 5 mess ups that I'm going to recap right now. So number 1, choosing a person versus a topic when it doesn't make sense for your listeners, reading the bio verbatim, inviting someone on the show to fill a spot because you have to, without consideration of alignment of what they bring to the table, having a guest over and talking over them, or just having constantly the need of constantly talking and adding to what they said, and then a messy outro with absolutely no idea of how you're going to close the show. All of these can be fixed by 3 different ways. Number 1, prepare and practice. Like that really, really helps. And so the more podcast interviews you make, the more you will get comfortable in. So if you're in the beginning of the stages of interviewing people and you're like, oh my gosh, I always mess up, carry on doing it, right? So make sure that you have all the prep in the world, all the notes that you can have, and just know that you can always re-record it in post-production. And the more you own it, the better. And then number 2 is understanding you'll mess up sometimes. Some shows will be better than other shows, and it's just okay, right? Like what we're looking at is incremental growth and incremental steps. Last but not least, hire a coach or a consultant to help you fix those like holes in your processes, in your hosting personality. That's something that I do, and I would invite you to go to thepodcastspace.com. On the tab services, you can read all about the offers that I have for podcasters just like you who are either starting their journey in podcasting or they want to improve it and fix those blind spots. You can go and visit thepodcastspace.com. And if you are more of a DM person, Instagram. I'm at The Podcast Space, and I cannot wait to hear from you. Tell me what you thought of this episode, but just create imperfect content that moves you forward. I'll see you in the next episode.